Hi everyone, I'm your host, Tom Spare, and welcome to Spare a Thought, the podcast where I focus on the people and organisations whose work often goes underreported or is misrepresented in the media. This is the third of 4 special episodes of Going Spare in the USA. Over this mini-series, I'll be sharing my trip reflections and the sounds of the 4 cities I visited whilst out in the US in October and November 2024. New York City, New Orleans, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. This is part 3, a pilgrimage to Atlanta. It's November the 1st, 2024, 4 days before voting day. I left my apartment in downtown to take an Uber to New Orleans Amtrak station, arriving at 7:49 in the morning. For such a famed and vibrant city as New Orleans, the train station was a little underwhelming. It did not possess the grandeur of either New York's Monahan Train Hall or Washington, D.C.'s Burr Arts-style design. Instead, New Orleans station exterior was boxy, airport-like and functional. Inside, the ceilings were low-hanging with dim lighting. The place was nearly deserted. I checked in my suitcase and took a seat. I phoned Mum to give her an update of my journey so far. I saw a poster for my train route, the Crescent, an Art Deco inky purple design depicting a train passing through the countryside under a crescent moon. The route I was taking to Atlanta, Georgia, would traverse 4 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, close to 450 miles in 12 hours. My train was called, I said farewell to Mum, and queued for the 9:15 a.m. 20 Crescent Amtrak to Atlanta. Because I'd booked a roomette, I was given priority boarding. It was another reminder of when you have the means, you can skip any line in the US. A member of the Onboard crew, Holly, was assigned to look after me and any passengers on the same carriage. Holly called me Mr. Thomas. My room was compact but private, with 2 facing seats that converted into a bed, and another fold-out bed above me. The sliding door had a metal hook for a lock. The toilet and shower room were separate, shared with other passengers in the carriage. Before we departed from the station, Holly asked me for my breakfast order. My ticket included 3 meals, and the food was surprisingly good. Think airline food, but on tracks. This would be the longest continuous train journey I'd taken in years. At first, the train was slow out of the station, but once it left the built-up areas, it picked up speed. Suburbs gave way to towns, which gradually dissolved into small holdings and scattered structures. Before long, there were far more trees than people. We passed countryside a deep, swampy green. Despite the late autumn heat, the trees and foliage were nourished and bountiful, fed by the estuaries of the Mississippi and the surrounding swamplands. Through the journey, as we crossed the border from Louisiana into Mississippi, heading east and then tacking northeast, the dark evergreen swamps were replaced by burned orange, red and brown. Swamplands became forest and woodland. Holly had mentioned the train toilet lock, but I hadn't registered the information. There were a couple of steps to process, and I didn't complete either of them, although I thought I had. A young woman pulled open the door. Luckily, I was not caught in a compromising position. I apologised profusely and finished up in the loo. My advice to you: always check the lock on an Amtrak toilet. After a bit of downtime in my cabin, enjoying the world speed by outside, I headed to the dining car for lunch. On the way, I met the young woman who'd opened my toilet cubicle door. Turns out she was studying computer science. Her and her travelling companion were headed for New York. The 3 of us sat down for food. The dining car was decorated with tablecloths, cutlery and condiments. The colour scheme a mix of burgundy, dark navy, faux wood fixtures and black cushioned seats. The windows were table level, offering good views outside. Together, the three of us had wide-ranging conversations, taking in the allure of Donald Trump, the writer's strike in Hollywood, the dangers of AI, and a host of other topics. It was a novelty having an extended conversation after so long of travelling solo. It was during interactions like that one over lunch that I missed my partner, and I missed home. I missed having my travel buddy, someone to share the journey with, someone to confide in. Up until that point, I had not felt particularly lonely, but after that conversation, I did. When I got back to my room, I pined for more conversation, but that would have to wait for the stopover at Birmingham, Alabama. The train came to its announced stop. Daylight was drawing in on another warm autumnal evening. During the pause in the journey, I started chatting to a member of Amtrak staff called Claude. Claude had worked for Amtrak for 26 years and planned on retiring the following year. He talked about growing up in New Orleans and his career as a social worker before working on the trains. He also talked about his experiences of the paranormal and his family links to voodoo. He recounted stories that left me convinced of connections to the spiritual world, including a powerful experience in New York during one of the lockdowns, where he saw a procession of spirits moving down an empty street. Claude explained that his family believed he had the sight, a voodoo belief for those born with hoods over their eyes, like he was as a child. In all honesty, I was glad to have been told all of this after leaving New Orleans. I've never seen a ghost or been in the presence of a spirit, but in speaking to Claude, I did start to believe. Checking his watch, Claude ushered us on board. Once we were on the move, I returned to the dining car for dinner. I was joined by the young woman and her companion. It was now pitch black outside as the train rumbled across the state of Alabama towards Georgia. We were due at Atlanta at 11 p.m. I said my goodbyes to the couple and returned to my room, slowly making my preparations for departure. It was close to midnight when the train shuddered to a halt at Peachtree Amtrak Station in Atlanta, Georgia. The station was tiny, even in comparison to New Orleans. It was just 2 tracks with a staircase and a lift leading up to a small waiting area, collection point and ticket office. New passengers were waiting for their ride. I headed out into the night, wheeling my suitcase across a foot and road bridge over a busy highway, en route to a nearby motel. The motel was just a few minutes' walk away, but as soon as I arrived, I immediately felt uneasy. I wanted to avoid waiting forever at the station alone for an Uber, so I'd booked into this nearby motel. After a quick exchange with a staff member to get my keys, I locked myself into my room. It was on the ground floor with the basic amenities. It looked like any other motel in a Hollywood film, and I could hear everything going on outside, the revving of car engines, the constant slamming of nearby room doors, conversations and footsteps. I was convinced there were bed bugs in my sheets, so I didn't bother sleeping inside the bed. Safe to say I got very little sleep. The 2nd of November 2024, 3 days before voting day. After very little sleep, I rose early and logged on to Zoom to record an episode of the Political Dispatch podcast with Sid and Lily. Afterwards, I packed, and then I opened my curtains. Outside, a fire truck and an ambulance had pulled up. I wasn't staying around long enough to find out what the cause of that call-out was. I checked out and took a cab to my apartment. My Uber driver said the motel I'd been staying in had a bit of a reputation. It came as no surprise to me. After checking in to my apartment and grabbing some food from the local market, I left the very empty Atlanta city centre and took an Uber up to the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum. This visit had been high on my list. For a bit of context, there are 16 of these presidential libraries across the US, all overseen by the National Archives. They exist to bring together the documents and artifacts from a president and their administration, presenting them to the public for study and discussion, and crucially, without any political bias. This system was started because so many Presidential papers were being lost or destroyed, so Franklin D. Roosevelt pioneered the idea in 1939, which Congress then formalized. It's a way for the American people to truly own and understand their history. And the sheer scale of what they hold is incredible. We're talking hundreds of millions of pages of documents, millions of photographs, countless hours of film and audio, and nearly 750,000 museum objects. It's not just official papers from their time in office. These libraries house everything from a president's personal notes to family heirlooms, campaign memorabilia, and even gifts from global dignitaries. You can even find papers relating to their careers before and after the presidency. Each library becomes this incredibly rich source, helping us learn about the nation and its democracy through the lens of one administration. This was my second visit to a presidential library, the first being the JFK Presidential Library Museum in Boston, Massachusetts, on my previous trip to the US. Carter had actually opened JFK's Library Museum in 1979, but the two were very different in appearance. JFK's Presidential Library is a modernist structure featuring a stark white precast concrete tower connected to a glass and steel pavilion. It is a bright, open space that was easy to navigate and connects seamlessly to the waterfront. The views spanning South Boston, Thompson Island, and Massachusetts Bay beyond. The Carter Presidential Library Museum was designed in a much less ostentatious manner, far more reflective of the man after which it is named. Humble, quiet, unassuming. Nestled on a hill overlooking Atlanta, the 39th President's Library Museum was peaceful, green, and set away from the road. The site was made up of the Library Museum, run by the National Archives, with sloping grounds leading to a lake. Across the lake was the Carter Center, a not-for-profit run organisation dedicated to mediation and peace building. President Carter had just celebrated his 100th birthday, although in failing health. He was the longest-lived president, and after just one term in the White House had left the presidency some 43 years earlier. I felt honoured to be celebrating Carter's life whilst he was still in the world. I entered the Presidential Museum via a neatly pruned garden complete with a small pool of water features and a colonnade shaped like an angular C mimicking the White House design. I arrived inside to a reception area filled with the tables of Girl Guides of America presenting posters of their good deeds. It was precisely the kind of event the president would have welcomed, young people serving their country and their communities. After buying a ticket, I headed to the cinema where an introductory video was playing, narrated by Martin Sheen, before proceeding to the exhibition space which charted Jimmy Carter's life from the farmhouse to the White House.
Then I will start my day's work of meetings with my cabinet members or my staff members.
The exhibition truly underscored the extraordinary life, presidency and legacy of the 39th President of the United States. He was a man of integrity and humility at a time of scandal and turmoil in the United States. His presidency was famously wedged between the tainted half-term of Gerald Ford and the laissez-faire Ronald Reagan. In fact, President Carter was the sole Democrat to occupy 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue between 1969 and 1993, making his rise to the highest office in the land that much more remarkable. Born on the 1st of October 1924 in Plains, Georgia, a small rural town that shaped his values and character, he grew up on a peanut farm. His modest family's means taught him the importance of hard work and community. He attended the US Naval Academy, graduating in 1946, and served as a Navy officer working on early nuclear submarine programs. After his father's death in 1953, he returned to Plains to take over the family peanut farm, which he transformed into a profitable business. A devout Baptist, Carter's faith played a central role throughout his life and influenced his moral compass. He and his wife Rosalind were married for an incredible 77 years. She was one of his closest advisors and confidants. Carter entered politics in 1962, winning a seat in the Georgia State Senate, advocating for desegregation and civil rights. After losing his first bid for the governor in 1966, he ran successfully in 1970, positioning himself as a moderate on racial issues. As Georgia governor from 1971 to 1975, he championed education reform, government efficiency, and racial reconciliation. He gained national attention with his integrity and outsider image after the Watergate scandal, leading to his successful presidential campaign with victory over Gerald Ford in 1976. As president, his key achievements included brokering the Camp David Accords to secure peace between Israel and Egypt. He established the Department of Energy, signed the Panama Canal treaties, and made human rights a cornerstone of US foreign policy. He also advocated for environmental conservation, expanding the national park system. Carter left the presidency aged 56, relatively young for a president. While the post-presidency can be challenging for many, he truly reinvented it, dedicating nearly 45 years to public service. Together with Rosalind, he set up the Carter Center in 1982, a non-profit organization focused on advancing peace, human rights, and global health. He helped eradicate diseases in Africa, monitored over 100 elections worldwide, and offered his negotiating skills to broker peace deals. He authored numerous books and actively worked with Habitat for Humanity. He remained dedicated to his community of Plains, Georgia, where he preached often at the local Baptist church. His legacy will most probably be defined by what he has achieved after his presidency, but for most of his life he dedicated himself to the service of others, his faith, and devotion to his country. As President Biden noted on his passing, for anyone in search of what it means to live a life of purpose and meaning, a good life, study Jimmy Carter, a man of principle, faith, and humility. After touring through the museum, I spent some time walking around the grounds. It was a warm, bright November's afternoon. It was the first time in nearly a week I'd had some time to properly reflect and take in my surrounds. A brief pause in my fast-moving trip. It might sound a little overblown, but visiting the Carter Presidential Library and Museum had restored my faith in the promise of America. The idea of a good man being elected to the White House, a man dedicated to service, dedicated to his family, to the country he loved. He achieved more outside of office than in, and I left feeling reinvigorated. The 3rd of November 2024, 2 days before voting day. I walked from my apartment towards the city centre. It was a muggy day, the sky marble grey. A brick column demarcated an incredibly important place in US history. The column bore the words Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park. Below the words, a black and white image of Dr. King holding his daughter Bernice aloft. In the top left of the image were the words from a speech of his, probably his most famous. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. I walked towards the visitor centre down a path lined with an avenue of trees. The National Historic Park is not what you imagine. It's not a large reserve of land filled with mountains and forests. It's not a projection of US power, and it's largely devoid of any grandiose statues. Instead, the park is made up of 3 blocks and several streets, primarily red brick buildings, connected by brick pathways and avenues of trees. The central hub is the visitor centre, which hosts a series of exhibitions about the life and legacy of Dr. King and his search for morality in an unjust and racist society. Next to the visitor centre is a community resources complex and the Horizon Sanctuary, a much larger church that was an expansion of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is located across Auburn Avenue Northeast. I joined a small group of visitors at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, welcomed inside by a park ranger who took us on a social history of the neighbourhood, the church, the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his family, and the civil rights movement. That story began with Dr. King's grandfather, A.D. Williams. Born at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation in Georgia, Williams' calling to preach was evident from childhood, eventually leading him to the pastorate of Ebenezer Baptist Church. For over 25 years, he infused his ministry with social activism, pioneering an African-American version of the social gospel that combined self-reliance with civil advocacy. He was instrumental in establishing the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP and tirelessly worked to register black voters, facing down racist newspapers and even armed mobs. His daughter, Alberta Christine, married Martin Luther King Sr., and it's clear that the foundations of social justice, civil rights activism, and the powerful preaching that defined his grandson, Martin Luther King Jr., were deeply rooted in A.D. Williams's remarkable life and ministry. The park ranger also highlighted the incredible tragedy that surrounded the King family. King's younger brother died in suspicious circumstances from drowning just a year after his brother. Perhaps most tragic of all, Dr. King's mother, Alberta Williams King, was playing the Lord's Prayer on the piano when 23-year-old Marcus Wayne Chenault stood up and shot Williams at point-blank range. In the church her father, husband and son had made so famous, she was murdered by a young black man yelling, "You are serving a false god." This version of events had been absent from my teaching. To know not only Dr. King was assassinated, but for both his brother and mother to meet such tragic ends. I sat in the church as the park ranger was talking, looking around at the simple design, the stained glass windows featuring A.D. Williams and Martin Luther King Sr., to think of all the history and the pain, the joy and the loss that had reverberated around those walls. At the end of the tour of the church, the park ranger took us through to a large aerial black and white photograph of Dr. King's funeral procession. His funeral was held in the church, attended by some 1,300 people, including a remarkable array of figures from across the political spectrum, like Richard Nixon and Robert F. Kennedy, as well as Jackie Kennedy and Ted Kennedy. Beyond the political elite, King's essential collaborators were there alongside icons from the music, film and literary worlds, and many sports stars, including James Baldwin, Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, and Paul Newman. I left the church with far more questions than answers, my mind filled with the inspiring, the tragic, the history-making moments of the Ebenezer Church. That experience stayed with me since. It's an experience that truly altered my life. To have been to the place where Dr. King and his family preached, to learn so much about the community in which he grew up in, the community that was, for a time, one of the richest black neighborhoods in the whole of the United States. Taking a left from the Ebenezer Baptist Church, I walked past the King Center, which was closed on the day, but contains mementos and photos from Dr. King and his wife Coretta Scott King's life. It's worth noting that the park was the brainchild of Coretta, an advocate for civil rights herself. Through speakers were projected the speeches of Dr. King.
Tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds.
At the opposite end of the pool was Freedom Hall, which housed several exhibitions, including a floor dedicated to Gandhi, whose peaceful non-violence resistance inspired the work of Dr. King. On the next block over, opposite a row of shotgun houses, stood the birth home of Dr. King. The house was temporarily closed for refurbishment. Behind the centre stood the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. fountain, which ran water down steps reading the words, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." That water fed and surrounded the tomb of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, which sat on a circular brick platform. I thought back to my visit to Dr. King's memorial in Washington, D.C. in 2022, and my journey to see JFK's burial site at Arlington National Cemetery on the same trip. Dr. King's tomb was not adorned with an eternal flame, nor was it surrounded by thousands of notable citizens, soldiers or leaders. He was instead laid to rest in the heart of his community. I spent some time walking around the tomb, reflecting on my pilgrimage to Atlanta to honour the lives of two extraordinary men who were not simply made by a wider society or culture, but heavily influenced by their families, their faith, whose deeds and acts were very firmly rooted in their communities they'd grown up in. Dr. King was buried alongside his wife in the community that had made him. President Carter is now buried alongside his wife in Plains, Georgia. Two men who in their own ways offered hope and justice in an age of violence, hatred, and despair. I left Atlanta profoundly changed. I was thankful to experience the message of President Carter and Dr. King in real life, to learn far beyond anything I could have picked up in a textbook or a documentary, to visit the places that a former president and the leader of America's civil rights movement called home. In the next episode of Going Spare in the USA, I fly from Atlanta, Georgia to Washington, D.C. on the eve of the US presidential election. I check into a hotel opposite the White House and I recount Election Day and the fallout. Thanks for listening to Going Spare in the USA Part 3, a pilgrimage to Atlanta. I'm Tom Spare. I wrote, edited and produced this episode. Additional editing by Emily Merry. The music is by Wondershare Filmora. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.